Randy Phillips. I like the radial engines, and so that's kind of where I've concentrated most of my interests. And talk a little bit today about just the genesis of the whole round engine line. And it's pretty interesting that they built everything from biplanes to trimotors. They built warplanes, and then of course to the 108s. The airplanes were flown by adventurers, endurance flyers, business leaders of the time. Even criminals flew the airplane. Horace Dodge owned several of them through his time. And they even appeared in movies like The Great Lantern and The Rocketeer. They were test beds for diesel engines, and even the early wing anti-ice systems were tested on an early Stinson. And just in the short amount of time we have to try to talk about all of them, there are around 2,500 round engine Stinsons built between 1926 and 1945. That's about 131 a year, and some of them went from design to certification within that time. There were 28 different models that they built, some of those having up to 9 different variations. They used 8 different engine manufacturers, everywhere from Kinner to Warner, Wright. They had some diesel engine manufacturers, of course, ending up with Lycoming. Horsepowers range anywhere from 100 horse all the way up to 450, depending on the airplane. They had names like the Detroiter, Standard, the Junior, Detroiter Junior, Stinson Wasp, Straight Wing, Reliant, Gull Wing, Money Pit. If you ever worked on one, you came up with names all on your own. But I think it's a good place to start was the very first one Eddie built. And it was 1919, 1920. He built his very first biplane. And you look at it, it's very typical of the time. As a matter of fact, he used a lot of Jenny parts for putting this thing together. It was real standard. 2-place open cockpit, 4 interconnected ailerons on the wings. And he took this thing out to the New York Air Expo in March 1920. March in New York in an open cockpit airplane. But it wasn't him building this thing that was so important, it was its crash. Because on his way back, the control stick broke off right down at the fitting, leaving him basically just rudder pedals and the throttle to control a crash, the airplane. But what that made him realize that if we're going to continue in the aircraft production world, we need to pay a lot of attention to quality control and excellence in manufacturing. So much so, he had the sign put up on the wall in his factory, emphasizing that what you do, a lot of people depend on. And that really set the standard for how these airplanes were built. And to their credit, pushing 90 years old, some are still flying. But then from then on, he went to, this is the first production airplane he built, the SB-1, Stinson biplane. And about 27 were built from January 26 through June of 27. It's a pretty big size, large airplane with a 36-foot wingspan. Just under 3,300 pounds, they had a Wright 220 engine. But it's fairly revolutionary for the day in that it was designed with an enclosed cabin, both for the passengers and the pilot. And a lot of the aviators at the time, the high experienced guys, thought that was just ridiculous. How can you fly an airplane without having your face out in the wind? They didn't think that was a very good idea, but Eddie persevered. And he designed it with a rather plush interior. Gone were the wicker seats. He had nice cushioned upholstery, even a headliner and insulation. He even outfitted it with the cabin heater, the exhaust manifold cabin heater. And again, it was built, it was first introduced in January of 26. So part of his demo flights, he'd fly around in just a shirt in northern Michigan. Again, demonstrating that it could be a very comfortable airplane to fly compared to what was around before. It's also pretty modern in the sense that he modeled it after the automotive steering wheel. It had electric start, one electric panel light, electric cigar lighter, but it also had differential braking, which again, pilots not liking change. They thought, well, you can't have, if you have brakes on an airplane, you got to put it right up on its nose. But this was the first time, what Eddie really wanted was an airplane that you could get in, start, taxi the runway without any ground handlers. No longer did you need somebody on a wingtip to help you turn the airplane. And that's kind of what he achieved with this. Other options he had were tire chains and skis for your winter enjoyment flying. And he would demonstrate with the brakes and those tire chains on just how rapidly he could bring the airplane to a stop on a snowy runway. But as with everything else, accidents are usually the mother of invention. The story goes, Stinson was given a ride to another guy in one of the biplanes, and the starter failed, so he's going to have to get out and hand prop it. Well, he told his passenger, just crack the throttle. Well, he kind of misheard. Gave it a little bit more juice than it needed. So as soon as the engine caught, off the airplane ran, and literally hit a hot dog stand. So it made Eddie realize that airplanes need parking brakes. They need an emergency brake system. So when he got back to Detroit, he designed it, included it in the rest of his models. Oops. There we go. Another interesting thing with the enclosed cockpit, you got to remember 1926, there weren't a lot of improved airports around. So a lot of the operations were in fields and pastures. And back then, the pilot could just look outside the fuselage, see what he's landing in, see what he's going to put the wheels down. Well, being inside now, that's what this square window right on the boot cowl is. Basically, so they could look out, the pilot could look out and see what kind of terrain he's actually landing on. It was very popular with some of the early airlines. As a matter of fact, Northwest Airlines started operations in 1926 with 3 of these biplanes. It flew with Florida Airways. They ended up going to Alaska with Wien Airways. And it actually was even imported to Canada. And the interesting thing about this particular airplane, remember 1926, aviation in the U.S. was still kind of the wild, wild west. And in that year, the Air Corps was formed. The Bureau of Air Commerce Aeronautics Branch was formed. So as part of their charter, they began establishing airways, building airports, licensing pilots, and also certifying airplanes. This is the very first, this airplane right here is the very first one certified by the Bureau of Air Commerce after manufacture, giving its airworthiness certificate. But Eddie also knew that biplanes were obsolete. They're a thing of the past. And he wanted an airplane that could carry a load, to be economical for its owner, operator. He wanted one that was stable, easy to maintain, and inherently safe and easy to fly. So came his first monoplane, the SM-1. It was a huge airplane, 45-foot, almost 46-foot wingspan. 32 feet long, and you can kind of see, that's why I like this picture, because the guy's standing there, but it's an 8.5-foot tall airplane with a 4,500-pound gross weight. This is a big machine. He styled, this is probably the first case of aircraft standardization. He modeled the cockpit very similar to the biplane. The steering wheel, differential braking, electric start, and you can see this is the last model with those little landing windows on the boot cowl. The construction of the two, and this followed pretty much through all the straight wing airplanes they made. The fuselage was welded chromoly steel. The wings were wood, spruce spars, routed out spruce spars. They started out with wood plywood for the ribs. Eventually they used some aluminum and even stainless steel ribs on them. 165 of these things were built all the way up through 1930. And of this, there were 9 different models offered, different cabin outfits and from freighters, and they offered pretty much the 220 or the 300 right. They did fit Packard diesels on 2 of these, and they found it was a very efficient engine, but it's just not really viable at the time. They ended up in China with China Airways. They went down to Peru with Fawcett Airlines. They were there at the beginnings of Braniff, and even the air taxi operators and the freight operators around the country loved the airplane. It was also rather popular with smuggling. Several were confiscated by the customs. Of course, you got to remember it's prohibition, and so they were caught hauling liquor back in. And you got to figure with a 2,200-pound useful load, that's a lot of whiskey and bourbon to bring in.
Is this still with a skid on the back?
Yes. They were built with a skid and then modified kind of through the years with a tail wheel. But I think the most important thing that this first monoplane did is part of this whole post-Lindbergh endurance flying. It's kind of the period of the death or glory with some of these young aviators. The kid here, the guy on the right, 26-year-old Paul Redfern, he's an ex-barnstormer. He ended up modifying the Port of Brunswick for an intended nonstop flight from 4,700-mile nonstop flight from Brunswick, Georgia to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. They ended up modifying this one. They were able to put 550 gallons of gas in it to a 5,300-pound gross weight. And he departed Brunswick August of 1927. Last he was sighted was right off the coast of Venezuela by a Norwegian freighter. They never found any parts of the airplane, never found him. Another interesting flight was George Halderman and Ruth Elder. She got her license, and of course she was dubbed the Flying Beauty by the press at the time. But she wanted to be the first female to cross the Atlantic. And of course this is several years prior to Amelia Earhart doing it. But they were going to do their flight in October. October crossing the Atlantic is not the smartest thing to do. So one is they planned their route further south to stay along the shipping lines, hopefully out of the storms in the North Atlantic. And they also, from all the other aviators that were lost at sea on these long endurance flights, that was their airplane, the American Girl. But they were going to take these immersion flotation suits with them, just in case they had to ditch, which turned out to be a good idea, because just north of the Azores they busted an oil line, ended up having to ditch, and were picked out of the ocean by a Dutch freighter. Fortunately, they saw it as they were kind of contemplating what they're going to do as the oil ran out.
What year was that?
October 27.
I mean, you think about it, but for a part failing, they weren't terribly far from making that.
Oh, very true. They were very close.
I mean, that would have been a historical rewrite.
It would have. Well, it would have been the first female going across.
Yeah.
And I think this is an interesting one. The guy on the left, Bert Fish Hassel, and his mechanic co-pilot, Shorty Kramer. Fish Hassel was a big proponent of Arctic flying. And he wanted to develop, he thought this flying over water was crazy. So he wanted to develop an Arctic Great Circle route from North America to Europe.
Wow.
And so he modified, again, one of the SM-1s, the Greater Rockford, for a survey flight from Rockford, Illinois to Stockholm, Sweden. And they took off and actually made it all the way to Greenland, where weather, winds, and fuel exhaustion made them land on the ice. It took them 12 days to walk off. But the interesting thing about this is that the routes that he surveyed were instrumental to some of the air routes that the World War II forces took to transfer airplanes over. And one of those airplanes in 44, I believe it was, spotted the wreckage, took a photo of it. Fish Hassel was a lieutenant colonel at Gander, I believe it was. He recognized it. Hey, that's my old airplane. Well, in the 60s, they were able to plunk it off the ice, return it to the States, where it's at the Midway Museum now in Rockford. Pretty interesting, I think. These pictures have been kind of floating around Facebook lately. You talk about crazy people. John and Kenneth Hunter in the city of Chicago, 553 hours. 23 days they're airborne without stopping. They had to build that catwalk in the forward part of the airplane, which I'm sure was FAA approved at the time. But they got up there, and back then the rocker arms were exposed. They had to get up there and periodically oil and do other maintenance. And I'm not sure what this sign is actually referring to. It looks like it says we broke it. I'm not sure he's talking about the endurance record or the airplane. But I don't know if it can't be a comfortable spot to sit.
Spirit Airlines
That luxurious. But they were refueled and replenished by another SM-1 flown by their brothers, the Big Ben. And they dropped stuff through that open hatch in the top of the fuselage. All the stuff they needed, from parts to fuel, oil, food, fresh clothes. But some interesting statistics about that flight. 553 hours, 41 minutes, 30 seconds. They were airborne. They figured at approximate speed, they covered a distance of 38,000 plus miles. And you figure the circumference of the Earth at the equator, just under 25,000 miles. While in flight, they changed spark plugs, replaced an engine mount bolt, and of course they're constantly messing with the rocket runk. At one point, Kenneth, the younger brother, it's always the younger brother has to do this shit. He had to climb out on top of the fuselage, shinny down back to the tail to free some debris that had gotten caught there during one of the refuelings. And I mean, can you just imagine the weight difference?
I'm making an assumption. No parachutes.
Oh, no. No. Oh, I scoff at the suggestion.
But there was something that they couldn't go down to like 10 feet above the earth, right? I mean, they could.
Just couldn't touch down.
So did they do that, or were they just like fall from above?
Oh, I think it's just, you're going to fall, you're going to fall.
Okay, you one more
At
there.
least there's like a hope of a chance,
Maybe
right?
over water.
Yeah.
Um,
But they had
Yeah.
300 contacts for fuel, oil, provisions, parts. They burned 7,650 gallons of gas, 380 gallons of oil. And you figure back then, 500-600 hours was TVO for these motors. And here it's pretty well evident. When they started, it was burning less than a quart an hour. At the end, it's more than 2 gallons an hour. It's kind of, the Kenneth on there was quoted in the newspaper at the end. It says, plain hell. We ate oil, smelled it, breathed it, laid in it, rubbing it all over us. We've had enough flying to last us a long time. But the important thing I think about Stinson's first monoplane is he really set the stage, not only for Stinson production, but for the viability of the design. It was buildable in mass quantity. It was economically efficient for the owners. They could make money with it. Pilots liked it. Mechanics felt it was easy enough to maintain. But the time this was built, of course, the Great Depression was going on. And Eddie Stinson and Bill Maher figured out, well, they were looking at the marketplace. We need to get a whole different type of people into our airplanes. Hence the junior design is a scaled down version of it. But that was marketed towards the personal flyer, the amateur sportsman, the small business, flight schools, small town charters. And the next group of airplanes, the junior series, you can kind of see all the similarities. The flat panel windshield, they're all now built with tail wheels. The SM2 had a stick, went back to more conventional type control system. And you even see some of the change occurs versus the straight wingtip. They're starting to curl the wingtips. And the other thing that they decided that what they needed to do was have a dealer network, modeling it somewhere after the automobile. But now the guy in California doesn't have to come back to Detroit to buy a new airplane. He can just go to his local dealership, not only get his plane fixed, but to look at the new models. And of course, you looked at it's like it went from SM2 to SM7. It's like, well, where in the hell are the other ones? The 3 is this is kind of the experimental phase. The 3 was a low-wing airplane that just didn't do much. SM4, the Sally Sovereign they called it, was built as an endurance airplane that really didn't endure very well. There's the Stinson Wasp. About 10, 13 of them were built, but of course it had a Pratt Whitney Wasp engine, hence the name. But I think the funnest one to have been able to fly was that Model M. It was built as a speedster. They wanted to try to break speed records. And from everything I've read, it's kind of an unstable airplane, and so it only lasted about 3 years before it was lost. But I think an important airplane to talk about of all the various models is the Model R. Introduced in 1932. Only 36 were built, but you can see they really went to the rounded wingtip. And kind of a total different wing design in that the double strut brace wing and these little stub wings for the gear. And that was because they experimented with retractable gear on this model. They only built about 3 of them, because with all that mechanism up in there, it just didn't give them the performance they wanted. It only gave them about 4 knots or so. So it really wasn't viable to do. But the most important thing about this airplane is when Eddie was flying, when he hit the pole in Chicago and suffered the fatal injuries. He was flying a Model R. During this period, though, they'd also been messing around with the airliners. They wanted to kind of get in the airline business. So they developed this, the first one. Every time I read that, it's kind of, Binford 6000. But 6,000, 53 of these were made. It's a pretty big airplane, a 60-foot wingspan. This one was delivered in July 1930 to Ludington Lines out in Washington, D.C., but it was very popular out on the West Coast with Century Pacific, which later became part of American, and flew with a lot of other regional carriers. The next design was the Model U. Had bigger engines, so bigger useful load. They also had that stub wing design, which they could put more cargo in it. But I think we talked about this earlier. I think the prettiest one of the group was the Model A. Actually had flaps, retractable landing gear, but that's where this wing shape finally came about. One of the Stinson design engineers, Robert Ayer, was tasked with making a more efficient, higher performance wing. So he messed around with this design, and so much so that even wind tunnel tested it. But the story goes, he took one of these first prototypes, took off of Stinson's 1,200-foot runway, got to the 500-foot imaginary obstacle, and landed again, coming to a full stop with 400 feet remaining. And that's not bad for a 10,000-pound gross airplane. So it really did kind of demonstrate the performance value of this double taper wing design. But it also kind of signaled the end of the straight wings. And you can see it happening where the wing is starting to curve in here. This is the SR5 model, curve in at the leading edge of the wing root. But also with the SR5, this is the first one, production airplane that they had flaps on. And typical pilots not liking change, they figured these flaps were a disaster. Nothing good could come of having flaps on an airplane. But from this model all the way forward, every one of them had flaps on them, or speed arresters. Not much change between the SR5 and SR6 models. You can kind of see just a little difference in the windshield design. Co-pilot windows were a little different. They went from strut bracing from above to below. Other than that, they're very similar airplanes. The big change occurred, with the SR7. That was the first one where they incorporated that double taper wing. And you see it's single strut braced. The 7 and 8 were very typical of each other, except for minor cabin and engine changes. But here's where they changed the whole structure of the airplane. As you saw with Jody's pictures, on the early planes, the main spar was heat-treated steel. It was an I-beam aluminum rear spar, square aluminum tubing for ribs, vacuum flaps. But here's that typical early gull-wing gear. Came down angled and pretty much vertical to the axle. And the V-77s come straight down and then the axle. So there's not that little vertical leg on it. I think the biggest change and the most stylish, if you will, the most Art Deco one that everybody recognizes is the SR9. But it's the only one with the curved windshields. They offered it on their deluxe model with a 450 horse engine. I think what was interesting with this airplane, back in March, the club was made aware of a fellow up in Michigan, George Duig, did I pronounce his name? Who we found out he's probably the last man standing that worked in the Stinson factory. And he was there in the late 30s, early 40s. And so the club wanted to kind of do something nice, so we presented basically just an appreciation plaque of the excellence in manufacturing that Stinson had done. It's interesting, he relayed a story about an SR9. And he was just a factory floor guy. And they were just pulling a SR9 fuselage out of assembly. It was just a bare tubing. And there were a couple of management uppity-ups there, and the chief engineer was standing there. They brought this airplane out in front. Management was patting themselves on the back on what a great job they do. And the engineer dude was kind of looking at it and tapping the tubing. He asked George for a hacksaw, and he cut a section of tubing out of the fuselage. Come to find out they used the wrong wall thickness. So he scrapped the entire fuselage. 10,000 bucks down the drain in 1930 something to manage it. But I think that reinforces.
Here's what I found.
that reinforces just their commitment to quality control, which I still think that's just an amazing story. But the SR-9 is such a beautiful airplane. The cockpits are just phenomenal. They're really modeled after the Cords, Packards, the high-end cars of the period. It was really popular as a float plane, both here in the States and over in Europe and Canada. It's a great ski plane. Is impressed by the Air Corps during World War II, as well as the Royal Navy in England. Last two ones we'll talk about, and Jody touched on this, the SR-10, the last civilian one, and then of course the 1819 or the V-77. And here's some of the differences. He touched on quite a few of them. And visually to tell the two, the first thing is the bracing for the horizontal strut. V-77 has a V, SR-10 has just a singular strut for the horizontal. You may see SR-10s today with smooth cowls, but very few of them came from the factory that way. Most of them are the bumped cowl. The wing spar, of course, we talked about that. The landing gear beam is different. It's about 2 feet longer. And a lot of these previous Reliants had an issue to where you put the flaps down and it got some tail buffeting. And as well as on landing of the previous SR series, it was a little bit of a struggle, if you will, to get the tail down. Well, lengthening that fuselage 2 feet took away the buffeting and made the tail a lot easier to control on landing. Plus, with that extra 2 feet, up in the engine area, it gave them a lot more room to work. Some of these, for example, on SR-9, SR-8, to take the generator off or starter, it's on a bump on the firewall. You got to go in through the interior, take the bump off the firewall, pull the starter out through the back. So by lengthening the fuselage, again, for 19-year-old mechanics in the military, you got to make it simple. So, but again, just comparing the two cockpits, the SR-10 instrument panel is just gorgeous. It's so period, if you will, versus the Spartan military V-77. One big departure between the two airplanes. The SR-10 had heel brakes. The V-77 went to the more traditional toe brakes. But again, neither of them have brakes on the co-pilot side. SR-10 was great on floats, worked well on skis. New York Police Department flew them both on wheels and on floats. Is a real popular airplane. This is a Bushman cargo conversion in the 60s they did out in California. Very popular with that. And it was also used by All-American Aviation in the Northeast as a mail pickup plane back late 30s. First V-77, and V-77, that's a 77th design of the Vultee Company, is where that came from. It was 1819, it's built for the British. They're going to use it as, like we talked earlier, on a navigation, radio, and a photography trainer. And so the fuselage was pretty much set up this way.
Wow.
Two big radios in front.
That's your plane, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Nice.
And a receiver in back. The receiver in back was set up so that they could mimic triangulating an aircraft carrier and figure out which quadrant they were from the carrier so they could get back.
Wow.
They had these yellow things and flame floats. They drop them through that hole. They'd go through the belly of the airplane, hit the water, the ground, and smoke. And then they could come back around, do their wind and drift sights. But again, even the cat in the interior is very Spartan. No insulation, no nothing.
Is that flame hole where you're going to drop your chicken? Had you brought your...
Yeah. When I bought this project, the guy that he had been working on it for a while, but he made, to fit in this hole back here, it's about this big around, but he made this 3 PVC pipes with these plates, little metal plates that could pull out. And water balloons about this big, fit
Oh.
really good down in each one of these channels. And then the lanyard came up front so you could pull them each individually from the pilot seat. And no, I haven't done that yet.
I like them already.
And what model is that?
It's V77.
377.
V77, yep. And it went from, as Jody showed, it went to Trinidad. 70 of them went down there of the 500. It went to England, went to Australia. That's where mine went, was to Australia. The Southeast Asia, and to India. Here it is. Here's one on the ground in India. That's very typical of what they did in Southeast Asia Command, is washing out the registration numbers. And there's another one with that wood prop on it.
That was built by Consolidated Vultee or Vultee?
Stinson Division of Consolidated Vultee. Yep. About 167 of the round engine powered airplanes were purchased by the War Department, anywhere from the SM-7 all the way through the SR-10. Most were used by the civilian pilot training program back then, although some were actually impressed directly into the Air Corps. 501, because there's one, the very last V-77 built, was a 450 horsepower built as a test airplane for the Navy. The Navy used it for about 3 months, sold it to the civilian world, lasted about a year, and was destroyed. When it was 350 came back, and to date I've been able to track 305 of those 350. But 12 were lost during Royal Navy service. 2 SR-7s were destroyed by Japanese bombing in New Guinea in 1942. Several of the 8s, 9s, and SR-10s were captured by the Germans and eventually destroyed in Europe. And it's typical British. Reportedly about 4 or 5 SR-9s were burned at the end of the war, being beyond economical salvage. No wonder they needed help to win 2 wars.
Sorry, so am I getting this, so the V77 was actually multiple different versions of the SR?
It was a redesigned SR-10.
But so can you go back a slide?
I certainly
So
can.
you're saying 167 radials from
Oh, yeah.
SM7 through 10?
Yes.
Through the SR10s, right?
Yep.
But then you're calling the AT, so the AT-19s
Is
are
different.
the V77s?
Yes.
Got it.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. But here's kind of just a production totals. They made about 2,500. Currently today on the FAA register of all of them, there's about 224. And of those flying, and I just extrapolated the number of V-77s flying to the rest, probably only 50 to 60 of all the various models flying today. And probably, I think the V-77 ratio is higher because there's more parts available. Being a military airplane, the drawings they were at the Smithsonian, so they're on microfilm, and now they've been digitized. So you've got a lot more technical support for the V-77.
All the manuals.
Oh yeah, manuals, everything you need to work on the airplane. Whereas the previous ones is typical 1930s manuals. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the history of the round engine motors. So.